Hello everyone, this is BAWLER with some important news for you. Subscribe and write your thoughts in the comments. Russia is teetering on the edge of a recession, an alarming message delivered by Russia's Minister of Economic Development Maxim Reshetnikov in late June. His words carried a barely veiled warning to President Vladimir Putin. End the war now or the country will suffer even more. The situation has become so dire that even Russia's central bank is urging Putin to pull out of Ukraine. The big question now is whether Putin will heed these warnings or if he's too far removed from reality to be influenced by his own advisors. Reshetnikov voiced his concerns during the annual St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, presenting a compelling case for his gloomy forecast. Our statistics show signs of cooling, Reshetnikov explained to attendees, but our figures are like a rear-view mirror. Judging from business sentiment and leading indicators, we appear to be on the verge of a recession. And he wasn't the only one raising the alarm. Russia's central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, echoed similar concerns, noting that the country is running out of resources. We experienced strong growth over the past 2 years by utilizing untapped resources, but now many of those have been depleted, she explained. Nabiullina wasn't only referring to materials and capital, she was also talking about human resources. With more and more Russians being sent to Ukraine, the country is now facing a labor shortage. This was evident in May, when unemployment fell to a record low of 2.2%. While that might seem like a good sign, it actually masks a deeper problem. There simply aren't enough workers to fill job vacancies, especially in the consumer sector. According to the Kyiv Post on June 23rd, Russia has had to recruit thousands of foreign workers from China, Turkey, and India to fill these gaps. In 2024 alone, 47,000 foreign laborers arrived in Russia. The trend signals a worsening labor crisis driven by the war. Unless Putin changes course and prioritizes the economy, 2026 will be extremely difficult for Russia. That message, however, has been clouded by mixed signals coming out of the country as Putin scrambles to control the narrative. Leading the contradictory messaging is Putin himself. At the forum, when questioned about the country's economic challenges, he downplayed concerns with a quote from American author Mark Twain, "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated," a statement he applied to Russia's economy. His optimistic tone stood in direct contrast to the warnings delivered by his own financial experts. While economists forecasted grim days ahead, Putin dismissed the notion and insisted the top priority is guiding the economy towards steady growth. He acknowledged that some experts see risks of stagnation or recession, but stressed that such outcomes must not be allowed. The ambiguity of this statement raises questions. Does he mean that recession must be avoided, or that public discussion of it must be silenced? Please support my channel with a small donation. It's not much for you, but for me it's an incentive to keep going and bring you important news. I've included a PayPal link to support my channel in the description for this video. Thank you. Russian economist Vasily Ostrov told Newsweek that economic policy remains one of the few topics in Russia where open debate is still somewhat possible, hence the range of conflicting views. But even these views are tinted by political affiliations and organizational interests. Ostrov emphasized that, unlike in Turkey under Erdogan, Russia still allows some space for economic discourse. So it's unsurprising that officials present differing views. Still, this reveals Putin's denialism. Experts are sounding alarms that his war is dragging Russia toward economic ruin, yet Putin plugs his ears and insists everything is fine, citing cherry-picked data. For instance, in April 2025, Russia revised its 2024 GDP growth projection upward to 4.3% from 4.1%. On the surface, that seems like good news, but the reality is more complex. This growth is largely driven by the war-fueled military-industrial sector, which hides the deep economic wounds inflicted by the invasion. Now those wounds are beginning to show. Cracks in Putin's economic policy are becoming impossible to ignore. All of Russia's financial problems trace back to one root cause, the war he began in February 2022. Take the National Wealth Fund, for example. Designed as a liquid financial buffer, funded by oil, gas revenues, and key investments, it's supposed to support the federal budget during crises. But that fund is rapidly depleting. According to the Kyiv Insider, in June, Putin once again dipped into the fund, spending $4 billion on the war. This left just $36.1 billion remaining. He also sold off 29 tons of gold, bringing the reserve down to 139 tons, and liquidated 11 billion Chinese yuan, leaving 153 billion yuan. To put things in perspective, at the start of the war, the fund held around 140 billion. That means Putin has burned through over $100 billion, and considering the inflow from ongoing oil and gas revenues, the actual war-related spending is likely even higher. As United 24 media notes, Russia has relied heavily on the fund to plug its growing budget deficit since the invasion. As of July 3rd, the fund had lost 68% of its value, and there's no indication Putin plans to slow spending. To make matters worse, The fund's composition has shifted dramatically. A 2021 mix of 45% US dollars and euros has been replaced by 60% Chinese yuan and 20% gold, signs of Russia's growing economic isolation from the West. And these assets are less liquid, meaning Russia now has slower access to usable cash. As the Kyiv Insider explains, ruble-based illiquid assets are rising, while dollar-based liquidity collapses. What remains is a reserve fund in name only, its value increasingly based on political manipulation rather than market reality. Even that alone might not trigger a recession, but combined with massive military spending, the effects are crushing. According to Ukrainian military intelligence chief Kyrylo Budanov, Russia is spending roughly $1 billion per day on the war. Defense now consumes a staggering 41% of the national budget. That spending comes at the cost of social programs, including healthcare and education. Russia's citizens are paying the price for Putin's obsession, and he's not stopping. In September 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia would increase its defense budget by 25% in 2025, totaling $145 billion. That would account for 32% of all government spending. Budanov believes the real figure is even higher. Politico also noted that, adjusted for purchasing power parity, Russia's 2024 military spending could rival Europe's total defense spending, coming in at $461.6 billion. Regardless of the metric, Russia is overspending on its military, worsening its economic decline. On June 27th, shortly after hearing from economists, Putin announced that defense spending would be reduced over the next 3 years. He framed it as a gesture of peace, but in truth, it was an acknowledgement that critics were right. Still, it's not enough to solve Russia's economic crisis. Inflation and high interest rates are compounding the damage. On June 6th, the central bank cut the base rate by 100 points, but it still sat at a steep 20%. With such high rates, borrowing and investment are extremely difficult. Meanwhile, inflation remains high, over 10% in February, 10.3% in March, 10.2% in April, and 9.9% in May. So ordinary Russians not only face difficulty accessing credit, but are also paying inflated prices for essentials like food and energy. And once again, the war is to blame. Western sanctions and Putin's militarization of the economy have triggered this crisis, and somehow the outlook gets even worse. Russia posted a 3.4 trillion ruble budget deficit in the first 5 months of 2025, about $43.2 billion, even though revenues rose 3.1% over the same period. That's because spending grew by 20.7%. This pushed the deficit to 1.5% of Russia's GDP. Running such a deficit means spending more than the country earns and falling further into debt. Without a way to increase revenue thanks to sanctions, the only option is to cut spending, which Russia is already doing. Budget deficits push interest rates up and deter investment. Russia is stuck in a vicious cycle, and until the war ends, that cycle won't be broken. That's why Russia's economists are pleading with Putin to end the war. They understand that the country is in a fragile, deteriorating state. As Velocity Media explains, Russian business leaders are speaking out about mismanagement and stagnation. Putin's pivot toward China and the global south hasn't produced the promised economic relief. Sanction evasion tactics like shadow fleets and Chinese trade were temporary fixes that are now failing. The EU is preparing an 18th sanctions package. Once passed, it will place even more pressure on Russia, whose only remaining lifelines, China and the shadow fleet, are becoming less reliable, tying the country even tighter to Beijing. Amid all this, financial experts keep repeating the same message: end the war. But will Putin listen? On July 3rd, Al Jazeera reported on a phone call between Putin and US President Donald Trump. Trump hoped to restart ceasefire negotiations, but failed. Putin insisted the war would only end once Ukraine submits completely. He still believes Ukraine must cease to exist as a sovereign state. Trump later admitted he was disappointed by the conversation. It revealed a hard truth. This war continues because of one man, Putin, and his unshakable belief that Ukraine belongs to Russia. That belief has brought Russia to the brink of collapse. What started as a short military operation has become a years-long conflict draining the country's resources. Putin has spent far more than planned, but his ideology remains rigid. He refuses to negotiate or retreat. Ending the war on any terms short of Ukraine's full capitulation is unacceptable to him. And so it doesn't matter how bad the economy gets. Putin will continue even if it leads Russia straight into economic disaster. As his underwhelming summer offensive burns even more money, the momentum is slipping away. To find out more about the collapse of Russia's economy and the truth behind this summer offensive, subscribe to BAWLER for more in-depth coverage.